All right, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's pretty intriguing and a little unnerving, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Deteriorated spiritual systems and cults.
Cults.
Yeah, we've got a lot of really fascinating sources. We've got academic studies and leaked databases, firsthand accounts, even some historical and philosophical texts.
Wow.
So our mission here is to give you the tools to critically evaluate different groups and teachings so that you can make more informed decisions about your own spiritual path.
Yeah, it's easy to think about cults as like, something out of a movie or,
Yeah.
like a sensationalized thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the truth is that harmful group dynamics can prop up
Oh,
anywhere,
yeah.
even in groups that seem spiritual or philosophical on the surface.
Okay, so let's just dive right in.
Okay.
One concept that really struck me from our research was this idea of supersession and renewal.
Uh-huh.
And this is basically the idea that spiritual teachings need to adapt as times and cultures change.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they become like fossils.
Yeah.
They're stuck in the past, and they could potentially lose their relevance.
Right.
And what makes this even trickier is that some groups actually try to mask this stagnation by clinging to outdated rituals or appearances.
Right.
It's almost like they're trying too hard to prove their authenticity.
Like they're putting on a show.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like they're confusing this outward piety with genuine inner development.
Oh, yeah.
One of the sources we looked at actually called these folks the people of externals.
Uh-huh.
They're focused on appearances over true insight.
Right.
And that can have some pretty serious consequences for individuals and the group as a whole.
So how do we see past that surface level? Like, how can we figure out if a group's spiritual practices are genuine or not?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the big warning signs is when a group overemphasizes systematization at the expense of a more holistic experience.
Okay.
They get so caught up in like rules and procedures that they kind of lose sight of the spiritual essence.
Right.
It becomes more about checking boxes than true transformation.
Yeah, and I think another red flag is like rigidly sticking to limited techniques regardless of individual needs or the context.
Oh, for sure.
Like maybe a certain meditation works for some people in some situations, but these groups will apply it to everything and everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, and that technique becomes the end goal
Mm-hmm.
instead of expanding their understanding of, all the different ways to approach these things.
Right.
They become fixated on this one thing, and it can actually lead to obsession and like a really limited view of the path.
And of course, there's always the classic red flag of charismatic leaders using theatrics or displays of power to manipulate followers.
Oh, yeah, the smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, and that could be really seductive, especially for people who are seeking guidance or certainty in their lives.
Right, but true spiritual teachers don't need to resort to those kinds of tactics.
Right.
They operate authentically and they meet people where they are without the need for grandstanding or showmanship.
Yeah, it's more about guiding, not controlling.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about some of these general red flags, but let's look at a real-world example to see how all of this manifests in a group.
Okay, that's good.
Have you ever heard of the Science of Identity Foundation?
Yeah, I have actually.
It's also sometimes called the Chaitanya Mission.
Right.
And there's been some controversy around them with accusations of being a cult-like organization.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not here to make any judgments.
Sure.
We're just going to present the information and let you draw your own conclusions.
Absolutely.
But what we do know is that CEF was founded by Chris Butler, who now goes by Jagadguru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa.
That's quite a mouthful.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And when we start digging into their activities, some potential red flags emerge.
Okay.
And these kind of align with some of the warning signs that we were just talking about.
Like what, for instance?
So ex-members describe things like restrictions on what they could read a strong emphasis on hierarchy and obedience, and even using social pressure and shaming tactics to maintain conformity within the group. Yeah, and then there are also claims of financial impropriety linked to some CIF members.
Oh, wow. So that raises concerns about exploitation.
Yeah, and perhaps the most troubling incident that we found was a case involving a Polish woman who left CIF and was later found deceased.
Oh, gosh. That's really troubling.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of what can happen when individuals feel trapped or controlled by a group.
Right. But we do need to be careful about drawing conclusions in that particular case.
Absolutely.
We don't have all the facts.
Right.
But to better understand these dynamics, I think it would be helpful to introduce a framework called the BITE model.
BITE. So is this going to involve garlic and wooden stakes?
Not quite.
Okay, good.
BITE stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control.
Okay.
And it's a way of understanding how groups can exert undue influence over their members.
So let's break it down.
Yeah.
What are some examples of these control mechanisms in action?
All right, so let's see.
Maybe even specifically within CEF.
Yeah. So those restrictions on reading material that I mentioned that would fall under information control.
Okay.
Limiting access to alternative viewpoints helps shape the narrative that members are exposed to.
They only get one side of the story.
Right.
And if they're also stressing hierarchy and obedience,
Mm-hmm.
that's behavior control.
Right.
Creating this system where questioning authority or expressing dissent is strongly discouraged.
You're supposed to just go along with whatever the leaders say.
Yeah, and then you layer on the social pressure and the shaming tactics,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you get emotional control.
Right. Using guilt and fear to manipulate how people feel and act.
Right, so it becomes really difficult to break free from that kind of environment when you're constantly being pressured to conform.
Yeah, it can be really insidious.
Yeah, so I'm starting to see how these seemingly subtle tactics can add up to a very controlling atmosphere.
Right.
Do you think the BITE model is a complete picture, though?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there other things that we should be thinking about when we're evaluating a group?
Yeah, I mean, the BITE model is a helpful starting point,
Okay.
but it's not the be-all, end-all.
Right.
There are other factors to consider, like the leader's motivations, the group's overall culture, and the specific context in which they operate. Like,
Right.
what might seem controlling in one setting
Uh-huh.
might be perfectly healthy in another.
So we need to look at the whole picture,
Yeah.
not just isolate a few elements.
Right.
So as we're evaluating these groups, is there a way to differentiate between healthy boundaries and undue control?
Yeah, I mean, it's not always easy.
Right.
But I think asking yourself a few key questions can really help.
Like what?
Well, does the group encourage open inquiry and critical thinking?
Okay.
Or do they demand blind faith and obedience?
Okay.
Do they respect individual boundaries and autonomy?
Ah.
Or do they pressure members to conform and isolate themselves from outside influences? And perhaps most importantly, are their teachings consistent with their actions?
Oh, that's a good one.
Is there a disconnect between what they preach and how they actually behave?
Okay, so I'm starting to see how important it is to develop our own discernment,
Yeah.
that ability to think critically
Yeah.
and to trust our gut feelings.
For sure.
So before we jump into part 2, what are some initial thoughts on how we can cultivate that inner wisdom?
Mm-hmm.
How can we make sure that we're not falling prey to manipulation? What advice would you give to someone who wants to be more discerning?
I mean, one simple but really powerful practice is to question your assumptions.
Okay.
Don't just accept things at face value,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to teachings or promises that sound too good to be true.
Right.
True spiritual growth is often challenging.
Yeah.
It requires us to confront our own shadows and our limitations.
Right.
So if a group is promising like an easy path or quick fixes, that's a major red flag.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the excitement of like a new teaching or a community.
Right.
But we have to remember to slow down, ask questions, and trust our instincts.
Absolutely.
Don't be afraid to step back and assess the situation objectively.
Yeah, and stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into the history of authentic spiritual traditions and explore some practical ways to find healthy communities and mentors.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the complex world of cults and spiritual systems in part 1. We equipped you with some critical thinking tools like the concept of supersession and renewal and the BITE model, just to help you evaluate, different groups and their teachings. We also took a look at the Science of Identity Foundation, and we kind of saw how some of those warning signs might actually show up in a real-world setting.
Yeah, and it's important to acknowledge that this can be some heavy stuff,
Right.
So in this part, we want to kind of shift gears a bit and focus on a more empowering message, the importance of discernment, and the very real possibility of finding genuine connection and meaning in healthy, authentic ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Mm.
We're not saying that all spiritual groups are bad
Right.
or that you should avoid them altogether.
Exactly.
It's more about being informed and discerning.
Right. Yeah, having that critical eye.
Yeah, but when we're talking about discernment,
Mm-hmm.
what does that actually look like in practice?
Okay.
What are some concrete steps that we can take to cultivate that inner wisdom?
So I think it really starts with questioning your assumptions.
Okay.
Don't just accept things at face value, especially when it comes to, teachings or claims that promise like easy answers or quick fixes.
Right.
Remember, true spiritual growth is often messy and challenging.
Uh-huh.
It requires us to confront our own shadows and limitations.
Yeah.
That's where the real transformation happens.
It's so true. And, it's tempting to kind of gravitate towards those who offer a simple solution or a quick path to enlightenment.
Right, it sounds appealing,
It does.
especially when people are feeling vulnerable or searching for answers.
Yeah.
They can be really susceptible to manipulation.
It's almost like we need to become spiritual detectives,
Yeah,
you know, carefully examining the evidence and asking tough questions.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most crucial questions to ask yourself is,
Yeah.
does this teaching or this practice resonate with my own inner truth?
Well, that's good.
It's not about blindly following someone else's dogma or beliefs. It's
Right.
about developing your own internal compass and learning to trust your intuition.
I love that phrase, developing your own internal compass.
Yeah,
It's like tuning into that inner voice that knows what feels right, what feels off, what aligns with our values and what doesn't.
exactly.
But how do we strengthen that inner voice,
Yeah.
especially if it's been silenced or ignored for a long time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one way to do that is to expose yourself to a variety of perspectives.
Right.
Don't limit yourself to just one teacher or one tradition. Read books, listen to podcasts, attend workshops, have conversations with people from different backgrounds.
Oh,
The
yeah.
more exposure you have to diverse viewpoints, the more you can start to discern what rings true for you.
So it's like expanding our spiritual palette and trying different flavors to see what we resonate with.
Exactly.
Like that.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering about the source of the teachings.
Okay.
Should we be paying attention to the lineage or the history of a tradition?
Absolutely. It's helpful to know where a teaching comes from, who the people are behind it, and what their track record is.
Okay.
One of the texts that we looked at for this deep dive, Keeping Faith with Katuri,
Uh-huh.
offers a really fascinating glimpse into the lineage of a specific spiritual tradition.
Okay.
It highlights the names and the contributions of numerous historical figures,
Wow.
showing how genuine spiritual paths often have deep roots and a long line of dedicated teachers.
So we're not just looking for a charismatic personality
Right.
or a flashy website.
Exactly.
We're looking for a tradition that has stood the test of time
Uh-huh.
and produced individuals who actually embody the qualities that we aspire to.
Right. And it's not just about the history or the lineage. We also need to look at the fruits of the teachings.
Okay.
What kind of people does this group or this tradition produce?
Uh-huh.
Are they kind? Are they compassionate? Are they balanced?
Right.
Or are they rigid, dogmatic, and judgmental?
Okay.
Do they contribute to the well-being of others?
Yeah.
Or do they create division and conflict?
That's a really powerful way to assess a group or a teacher.
Yeah.
Actions speak louder than words. And if the people within a community are embodying the values that they espouse, that's a pretty good sign.
For sure.
But with all of these potential pitfalls and warning signs, how can we actually find those healthy communities?
Right.
It can feel overwhelming, especially if you've been hurt or disillusioned in the past.
Yeah, it's understandable to feel that way, but I think one of the most important things is to stay curious and open-minded.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to explore different paths and traditions, even if you've had a negative experience before.
Right.
It's like learning to ride a bike again after falling off. Uh-huh. It might be scary at first,
Yeah.
but with practice, you can regain your confidence and find joy in the journey.
That's such a good analogy. We have to be willing to get back on the bike.
Right.
But this time we're riding with more awareness and discernment.
Yeah, we're paying attention to the road, the conditions, and our own internal compass.
Exactly. And, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Healthy spiritual groups welcome critical thinking, and they actually encourage members to develop their own understanding.
Right. They want you to think for yourself.
Yeah, they don't demand blind obedience or punish dissent.
Exactly.
They want you to engage with the teachings and make them your own.
Right. It's about empowerment, not control.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
A genuine teacher wants to empower you, not control you.
For sure.
They want you to become your own authority, not just a follower.
Right.
But what about those times when we make mistakes or get things wrong?
Mm-hmm.
What happens when we realize that we've been following a path that wasn't right for us?
Yeah, well, that's part of the journey, too. We all make mistakes.
Right.
And it's important to be gentle with ourselves when we do.
Ah,
Instead of seeing it as a failure, we can view it as a learning opportunity.
okay.
What did we learn from that experience?
Right.
What red flags did we miss?
Yeah.
What can we do differently next time?
So it's not about being perfect or never making a wrong turn.
Right.
It's about learning from our experiences and continuing to refine our discernment as we go.
Exactly.
But I can imagine it can be really painful to realize that a group that you trusted wasn't what you thought it was.
Yeah, it can be devastating.
How do people even begin to heal from that kind of betrayal and disappointment?
So it's a process, and it actually takes time. Yeah. One of the most important things is to validate those feelings of hurt, confusion, and anger.
Yeah.
It's okay to feel those things, you know? It's a natural response to betrayal and disillusionment.
So it's like acknowledging the wound before you can start to heal it.
Exactly.
But where do you go from there?
Oh.
How do you start to rebuild trust, not only in others, but also in yourself?
That's a great question, and it's one that we're going to delve into even deeper in part 3 of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, because we're going to explore the process of healing from spiritual abuse and rediscovering your own authentic spiritual path.
Mm.
We'll talk about practical strategies, resources, and ways to reconnect with that inner wisdom that can never be taken away. Welcome back to the deep dive. In the first 2 parts, we really dug into the warning signs of unhealthy spiritual systems and talked about how important discernment is. But let's face it, even with the best intentions, sometimes people end up getting hurt.
Yeah, that's true.
So in this final part, we want to shift our focus to healing.
Okay.
So what happens when someone has been, harmed or manipulated by a spiritual group? How do they rebuild trust? Not only in others, but also in themselves and maybe even in the idea of spirituality.
Right. That's a really important question. And I think the first thing to acknowledge is that healing from spiritual abuse, it's a journey. It's not a destination. It takes time, patience, and often it requires professional support.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach, and what works for one person might not work for another.
I imagine it can be incredibly disorienting to realize that, a group that you trusted and devoted yourself to turned out to be harmful.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like having the rug pulled out from under you.
Yeah.
You might have invested years of your life, your energy, your resources, and maybe even your identity into this group, only to discover that it wasn't what you thought it was.
Right. And there's often a profound sense of betrayal, confusion, and even shame.
Yeah.
People may question their own judgment, wondering how they could have been so misled. And it's not uncommon for people to blame themselves, thinking, I should have seen the red flags, or I was so stupid to believe them.
Right. It's like any form of abuse, really.
Exactly.
There's this feeling of being violated, of having your trust broken, and that can have a ripple effect throughout your life.
Right. And it's important to remember that the effects of spiritual abuse can be just as real and damaging as any other form of trauma.
Okay.
It can impact your relationships, your finances, your career, your mental health, even your sense of self.
Wow.
It can be a very isolating and painful experience.
So given all of that,
Yeah.
where does someone even begin to heal from this kind of experience? What are those first steps? What can someone do to start feeling whole again?
I think one of the most important things is to validate their experience,
Okay.
Let them know that what they went through was real, that their feelings are valid, and that they're not alone. So often people who've been in these kinds of situations are told that they're overreacting, that they're imagining things, or that they're just being negative.
Right.
But it's crucial to affirm their reality and help them understand that they were manipulated and that it wasn't their fault.
That makes so much sense. It's like creating a safe space for them to share their story and process their emotions without judgment. It's about letting them know that they're believed and supported.
Right. And once they feel heard and understood, then they can begin to rebuild trust.
Okay.
But it's important to understand that this process can take time. It's not going to happen overnight.
I understand, but how do you even begin to rebuild trust when it's been so completely shattered?
Yeah.
Where do you even start?
I think it starts with trusting themselves,
Okay.
encouraging them to reconnect with their own inner wisdom, their intuition, that internal compass that we talked about earlier.
Right.
It might sound strange, but sometimes after an experience like this, people lose touch with their own inner knowing.
Yeah.
They've been so conditioned to rely on external authorities that they forget how to trust their own gut feelings.
Right. It's like their inner voice has been silenced by the group's dogma and the leader's demands.
Exactly.
So how can they start to reclaim that voice?
I think one way is to start paying attention to their body's signals.
Okay.
Our bodies are incredibly wise, and they often give us clues about what feels safe and what doesn't.
So encouraging them to notice their physical sensations, their emotions, and their thoughts without judgment
Okay.
can really help them tune back into their own internal guidance system.
That's a great point. It's like learning to listen to the whispers of our body and our soul again, rather than just following the dictates of an external authority.
Right.
But I'm also wondering about the practical aspects of rebuilding trust.
Okay.
It's one thing to trust your gut, but it's another thing to trust other people, again, especially in the context of spiritual seeking.
Absolutely. And that's where setting healthy boundaries comes in.
Okay.
Learning to say no to protect their time and energy and to surround themselves with people who are supportive and respectful is essential.
Uh-huh.
They might need to take a break from organized religion or spiritual groups altogether for a while, and that's perfectly okay.
That makes sense. It's like giving themselves time and space to heal before jumping back into the deep end of the pool.
Right.
They need to rebuild their foundation of self-trust before they can safely navigate those waters again. Exactly. And as they begin to heal, they may find that their spiritual beliefs and practices have also been affected.
Okay.
Some people might feel completely disillusioned with spirituality altogether,
Right.
while others might feel drawn to explore their spirituality in a new way, free from the constraints and dogma of the group that they left.
So it's not necessarily about abandoning spirituality altogether,
Right.
but rather about rediscovering what it means for them personally on their own terms.
Exactly.
But what about the people who do feel completely turned off by spirituality?
Uh-huh.
Is there any hope for them to kind of reconnect with that part of themselves?
There's always hope. Sometimes people find solace in nature, in art, in music, or in spending time with loved ones.
Uh-huh.
The important thing is to find what brings them joy, what makes them feel alive, and what helps them connect to something larger than themselves.
Right.
It might not look like traditional religion or spirituality, but it can still be a profound source of meaning and purpose.
That's such a beautiful reminder that spirituality is a vast and multifaceted experience, and it can manifest in countless ways.
Absolutely.
It's not confined to a particular set of beliefs or practices.
Mhm.
It's about that connection to something greater than ourselves.
Right?
That sense of awe and wonder that makes us feel alive and connected.
Exactly. And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
Even though we've been exploring some dark and challenging topics, we want to leave you with a sense of hope and possibility.
Yeah.
Healing from spiritual abuse is possible, and it can be a powerful catalyst for growth and transformation.
Mm-hmm.
It can lead you to a deeper understanding of yourself, a stronger sense of discernment, and a more authentic and fulfilling spiritual life.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has been such a valuable conversation, and I know it's going to help so many people.
I hope.
Remember, if you've been affected by spiritual abuse, you are not alone. There are resources available to support you, and healing is possible. Trust yourself, stay curious, and keep seeking. And most importantly, never give up on the possibility of finding genuine connection and meaning, whether it's within a spiritual community or in the quiet moments of your own heart.